Hey guys, we are back in the car for the second part of our discussion. I don't really know how long this video will be. Probably not quite as long as the first half, but I just had a few more thoughts I wanted to wrap up with you all. Speaking on the archetype of a scientist. This word archetype, remember from what I said in the first video, it's sort of like, you could say almost like the perfect example of a scientist. Or another way to think about it, it's like the most original of something, the best example of something. So we did discuss a few characteristics that I thought were great. We talked about bravery and experience, intelligence. We also talked about how this is a person that would credit their peers and the people that came before them. Someone that's constantly looking to the future and thinking about ways to progress understanding. So these were all things that we talked about, and we talked about some scientists that exhibited a few of these features, like Sir Isaac Newton and Marie Curie. And for the second half of this discussion, we might talk about a few things. I do want to talk about how we as a group, how did we as a civilization get to this point where these questions started to become incredibly important to us? How did we start valuing this idea of seeking the truth and what doing and what we could achieve in doing so? This is kind of like at the core of science, that by seeking out the truth, we can make the world in which we live in a better place and make it a safer place and a place that is beneficial for everyone. So we kind of have to go back in time. Like I said, I'm a science teacher, but I love history as well. And I think it'd be a disservice to you guys. It wouldn't be a good thing to do if I were to just talk about science and not talk about the connections and the people involved and the way that these people have shaped our understanding and the big events that took place to lead us to what we know. And we really have to go back a long, long time ago. In a time before humans wrote things down, before we actually recorded what we knew. And this was a time called prehistory. And prehistory is a time, as I said, anything that takes place in human history when we didn't write that stuff down and we didn't pass along to those that came after us, this is called prehistory. And humans existed for a very long time during this era, right? And we lived in really small groups of about 30 people or so. And you really had two jobs. You were either a hunter or a gatherer. And you didn't have a lot of time to do much of anything else. Hunting and gathering was about it. That's all you really could do. And it took a long, long, long time before people started to settle in one spot. Some of the first places that this took place was in the Middle East, in a place called the Fertile Crescent. Modern day, this is where the country of Iraq is. There were some of the first cities, first civilizations in that area, and this is called Mesopotamia, this place on Earth. But the reason why this is so important, and the reason why I want to talk about it, is because this was the first time in human history where we had time to actually do other things. We had time to take on different roles rather than just being a hunter or a gatherer. You could now do other jobs because people were growing crops. This is called cultivation, when people grow crops in one place rather than going out into the forest and finding what they needed to eat. People were now raising animals. This is called domestication, rather than going out and hunting them. So this allowed us to stay in one spot and start building cities, usually by rivers, a source of water. And people could now become artists. People could become politicians. People could become merchants. There are so many different jobs that people could do, and they didn't just have to focus on, surviving all the time. And the word that we use to describe this is called specialization. And so along with doing those things, we started to really not just think about how do we survive, we started to think about why do we survive. We started to think about, why does this happen? Why does that happen? In the past, it wasn't important why, you wore fur to stay warm. You didn't need to know why. You just needed to know that you did it, or else you would freeze. But now, people had time to really think about that. People had time to start to ponder some of the bigger questions. And so we fast forward the clock a little bit out of the first cities and the first civilizations, like in Mesopotamia, and we can go over to Greece and learn about what these guys were doing and how they were advancing this whole new blossoming human characteristic, this idea of questioning. And we learn about the ancient Greeks, and they had a very special group of people that are still talked about today that had a love of knowledge. And you could say that they were like the very first scientists. But they weren't called scientists, and people really don't call them scientists today. What we call them is philosophers. That word philosophy, if we break it down to try to figure out what it means, we can understand a little bit better about what they were trying to achieve. So the word philosophy, the first part, philo, and then the second part, philosophy. So if you look at the actual meaning of the word, it means the love of knowledge or the love of learning. That first part of the word philo actually means love. You can find it in other words, like the city of Philadelphia. Their nickname for that city is the city of love, the city of brotherly love, I think is its nickname. But so that word, philo, is love. And philosophy just literally means the love of learning, the love of knowledge. So these philosophers, they would basically go around and they would study things and they would ask questions, and they were mostly concerned about understanding human nature, though. So we don't necessarily call them scientists because they really were more about understanding the way the mind works and dealing with that aspect of understanding. But they were still scientists because questioning was at the core of everything that they did. And the way they did that is they had to rely on certain tools to do this, to experience the world and to make and to create opinions about it and to create ideas about it. But being that they lived a very, very long time ago, they didn't have access to the things that scientists have today. Like scientists today have telescopes and microscopes and all of these finely tuned instruments that allow us to really start to peel back the curtain on things that were previously unknown or unseen. But these philosophers, they just had to rely on their tools of perception, the things that they could see, that they could hear, that they could taste and smell and touch. That's all they had. And you know what? Sometimes that's enough. It's enough to get started anyways, and that's what they did. They started using these tools of perception to build a better understanding about the world that they lived in. They weren't always right. They kind of had some pretty wacky ideas too. So if you ever go back and read about some of the ideas that some of these philosophers have, some of them can be kind of wacky. Like one of the things that they really like to do is they like to classify things into groups. And they had these opinions like, oh, okay, well, if it's something that can fly, it's related. So let's put everything that can fly in a group. Well, is a mosquito and an owl, are they? Yeah, they can both fly, but we now know that they're not super related. They're not very similar to each other. Even though they both fly, there are other bigger differences. And so that doesn't mean that they're failures, right? That just means that they were some of the first people to start doing this. And then knowledge was built upon what they discovered. One of the most interesting of the philosophers was a guy by the name of Socrates. And he developed something called the Socratic method. This was really just going around and asking questions. And in fact, he kind of annoyed people because he asked too many questions. he would go around and someone would say something to him, and he wouldn't just be, like polite and just say, oh, thank you for saying that, or blah, blah, blah. He would just answer their questions with more questions. So say if like someone came up and told him good morning or something like that, instead of just saying, oh, thank you, good morning to you too, he would ask them, oh, well, what makes a good morning? Why is something good? Why do people wake up in the morning? Why do we stay awake during the day and sleep at night? Everything had to be a question, and it really kind of drove everyone crazy that he would do that. He couldn't just take a compliment. He had to make everything into a lesson. But basically, this was the birth of one of the core components of the scientific method, questioning. Finding a problem and then beginning to sort of develop the questions that you need to think about in order to answer that. And so this Socratic method is still used today by scientists, but then he kind of stopped there. What he was able to learn basically just came from his conversations and his observations, but now we can take that even further. But questioning is still a very vital part of what scientists do. So that's one example of how the ancient Greeks begin to shape and develop our expansion of this field of science. But again, we don't really call them scientists, they're more philosophers. So we need to kind of fast forward the clock now even more. And we start to get to a time of really great progress with the Roman Empire, one of the largest and most vast empires that has ever existed. And it lasted for a very long time. And during this time, people, discovered great things about architecture and art and chemistry and metallurgy and all of these different fields of knowledge. But unfortunately, the Roman Empire collapsed, or part of it did anyway. Some of it did survive, and it was known as the Byzantine Empire, but the Roman Empire collapsed. And much of that knowledge that had been, developed over this long period of time was lost. And it took a very long time for it to be rediscovered. So this time period where a lot of that knowledge was lost, some people refer to it as the Dark Ages or the medieval time period. Now, these people weren't completely, lost or useless. A lot of good stuff still happened during that time period. A lot of really great things were happening in the Middle East during this time period. You had some of the most important discoveries in astronomy taking place in places like Libya and other areas of the Middle East. But this was definitely a pause in progress. And then came along something very important called the Renaissance, the rebirth of knowledge. That word Renaissance, it literally means a rebirth of knowledge. So people started to look back at the Romans and what they were doing and their ideas about learning. And the Romans had, they actually looked back at the ancient Greeks. And so all of this lost knowledge was now came back into popularity and was now being reused. And the last guy that I want to talk to you about, our last example of a really good scientist, an archetype scientist, might be our best archetype figure. And this was a guy by the name of Leonardo da Vinci, and he lived during the Renaissance. And he's often referred to as the true Renaissance man. A Renaissance man is someone that kind of is a bit of an expert in a lot of different areas. Most people, when they think about Da Vinci, they think about Da Vinci the artist, or Da Vinci the inventor, and he definitely was those things, and he was very good at it. But Leonardo da Vinci was, in his very true essence, he was a scientist. He was obsessed with learning and understanding. And that obsession led him, it was unquenchable. He had to do things that some people might even think are a little strange. For instance, he was very curious about the way the human body worked. Like, he wanted to know what the bones did and what they looked like and how they felt and how the muscles work and how the tendons of your hand work. Before this time period, if you were injured or you were sick, that was bad news, because this wasn't a time where the medical field was very advanced. But Da Vinci thought that by better understanding the human body, we could maybe progress our understanding of how to make ourselves more healthy. And what he would do, this is kind of, this is definitely one thing that is interesting to me that he did, that shows just how interested he was in medicine and the human body. He would actually go to the morgues of the city that he lived, and he would pay the people that cared for the dead bodies. He would pay them for those bodies so that he could take them back and he could examine them, and he could look, and he could cut them open and look at the muscles and look at the tendons and look at the skeleton. And everything that he did, he would draw these detailed images of and take detailed notes of so that he could better understand it. And some of his drawings were still used in medical text for years and years and years, and some still are. They're that detailed. They're that thorough. And what he did and what he was able to achieve really kind of represent a great example of the mind of a scientist. And there's some other stories that I could share with you guys, but we are running out of time just to do that today. But perhaps I might do a small other video at some point to talk about some other stories about Leonardo da Vinci, because he's a very fascinating figure. But I hope that our conversation, the first video and this video, have made you sort of open up your mind to what types of characteristics you need to exhibit to be a better scientist. This year, when we're discussing different things around the world, don't think about yourself as a student. I want you to be a scientist. We are in this together, and we're going to be kind of exploring how to make sure that you have all of those skills, all of the ability to have these conversations. And so I'm going to go ahead and sign off on this video, guys. Like I said, if I think of anything else to add, I'll probably add another small portion to this, but I don't want to take too much of your time, so please watch these videos. That's all I want you to do for today, is just watch these videos. Think about what I've talked about. I want to, at some point, I want to figure out a way. I'll start to engage with you guys and get you to share some of your thoughts about what I said. But yeah, I hope that this excited you, and that you're ready to become, in your own way, a scientist, because you can be a scientist in both big and small ways. You don't have to be like Marie Curie and work with radiation, guys. All you need to do is have an inquisitive mind. An inquisitive mind. To be inquisitive, that just means you're curious, that you want to learn. That's all you need. So, guys, I'm going to go ahead and sign off, and I will talk to you guys later on. I hope you enjoyed the videos.